Hello, invisible others, whoever and wherever you are. Welcome back to another episode. Actually, this is our 25th episode, so I guess it's like a milestone or something. So thank you guys for being with us so far. I'm joined with my co-host, Chris Beardsley. How are you this week?
Yeah, I'm doing well, thanks, Jake. Feel like I've been podcasting back to back this weekend
Yes,
because I was
professional podcaster. That's your new title.
talking with Rob yesterday when we did an episode on proximal to distal sequencing. That'll be out on Wednesday, so hopefully you guys will watch that as well, listen to that as well. It's started to get into interesting topics now. It's moving away from the basics of strength and speed and stuff like that, and talking about some pretty cool stuff. So looking forward to feedback on that one.
And last week, you said you had an event coming up that you were going to tell us more about today.
I did, and I completely forgot. Yes. So there's a post in my Instagram feed about it a couple of days back. I will keep posting it in my Instagram stories so people can find it there relatively easily. Doing a seminar on preserving muscle mass while dieting. It's the time of day is designed to be fairly early in the morning in the US. I think the earliest time in the US, I think, is 8 a.m. On the West Coast, but hopefully that'll be okay for most people. For me, it's last thing at night. It's in my evening, so again, it kind of captures hopefully a decent number of time zones. The only time zone it doesn't work for is you. It doesn't work for
It's in the
Australia.
middle of the night. Yeah.
It's the middle of the night, so hopefully we won't see anybody from Australia there. Obviously they can catch the recording later on.
So there will be like a recording download, something that people do.
There
They
will
need to
be a
sign up to
recording.
get access to that.
I would encourage people to sign up. I don't know how we will organize the availability of the recording afterwards. I'm not doing the technology part on that. So, but yes, I would just encourage people, if they are interested, to please sign up. And we will do, probably something else, later on, maybe early next year, and talk more about the topic, because there's a lot to say. And so I just want to leave it with this observation, which is that we are going to be talking about stuff that I've never seen anyone else talk about. I think there is stuff in there that is interesting and new. Maybe there is somebody who's mentioned it once, twice, but I don't see it commonly discussed. So there's going to be some new-ish physiology, not new in the sense that it's new physiology, but in the sense that it is relatively undiscussed or not unknown, but relatively poorly covered in the fitness industry on the topic of preserving muscle mass while dieting. So hopefully people will tap into to sort of learn about that if they can.
Sounds very exciting. And even for Aussies, yes, I think 4 a.m. or whatever time it is early. But, I was thinking about this before
I'm not
this.
going to let you turn up and sit in on this. If I see your name pop up,
Kick me out. Well,
I
hang
will
on.
kick you
Here's the
out.
thing, right? Like when I started in this industry, I would drive half a day. I would go interstate to go to a single day workshop. Yeah. Like that was the norm. People would fly across the world
Can
to
you
go to
get
this
outside of your state in half a day of driving? I don't think you can.
8 hours. Depends what your class is, half like a full day.
That's pretty much a full day.
But, people would do that. And ultimately what you're saying, you've got this event where people don't even need to leave their bed. They don't even need to pay for it. You just have to get up early. So I don't know if I will be there at 4 a.m. or
You
whatever
won't be.
time, but I can understand if someone does choose to do that. And I think that that's all power to you. I'd go for gold. Anyway, so to celebrate your new high performance physiology podcast, I am going to discuss a silver era athletic program today. So yes, you almost fell off your chair there. Now, this is a Bob Hoffman plan. So we've obviously talked a lot about, several times about Bob Hoffman in the past. So founder of York Barbell, kind of when it became York Barbell. So that was Bob Hoffman's doing. And then, behind Strength and Health magazine, and obviously super influential in the silver era, coach of the US weightlifting team, coached a lot of the early Mr. Americas, people like John Grimmick. So, incredibly influential character. And obviously part of what Bob Hoffman, his focus point was not just bodybuilding, but this intersection of bodybuilding with weightlifting and with other athletic pursuits. So he was one of the, I'm sure not the only person, but one of the earlier people to talk about weightlifting and more specifically, I guess, bodybuilding for athletes. So that's what this plan is. And in fact, he actually talks about plans for all kinds of athletes. And we may cover some of these in the future as well. He talks about, even like I think golfers and I think he talks about fencing and talks about, football and soccer. And I don't know if it's both football and soccer, one or the other, I assume. But there's dozens of different sports that he talks about training athletes for and how they can engage in bodybuilding activities. So pretty interesting stuff. And today we have the standard, like the very base plan that he would use just with generic athletes. This was his basic athletic program just to begin introducing an athlete to hypertrophy. So not over any specific goal. I guess the goal here would actually just be hypertrophy for that athlete, and then they could kind of siphon off to their particular sport. So this was a full body plan, as was fairly normal for Bob Hoffman and for most people at this time. And again, similar to a lot of York's plans, this was single sets. Obviously, York did utilize, and Hoffman did utilize multi-sets at different points. And again, sets were not necessarily the most important aspect of a plan. And they often talked about, well, you can do 2 sets, you can do 1 set, you can do additional exercises, you can do, there was a lot of variability and flexibility within that. But here he did specify 1 set and 6 to 12 repetitions, and doing that sort of, standard double progression method where you increase repetitions up to 12 and then you jump back down to 6. So barbell focused. And we begin with a barbell curl. We then move into a barbell military press, an overhead press, and then a stiff leg deadlift. We then have kind of like a combo exercise. So a barbell pullover that kind of moves into a bench. So yeah, I guess a bit of a complex there. Then into a barbell side to side bend. So this is where you would place a barbell on your back like a squat and literally just bend side to side with the barbell on your back. Then they did a barbell jump squat, which is exactly as it sounds, a barbell on your back like you're going to do a squat and you jump with it. Then a standard barbell bench press or supine press or whatever he would have called it at that point in time. And then a barbell clean, a barbell standing calf raise, a bent over barbell row, a barbell conventional deadlift. So we've got 2 deadlifts here. And then concluding with a barbell squat. Single sets of each. What do you make of that?
So let me analyze this in 2 ways since we introduced it as an athletic program. I'm going to start by treating it as a bodybuilding program because, we can kind of just ignore the jump squat and the clean and then just look at it and go, you've got 10 exercises there. What's the coverage of those? So as always, I think that back training is poorly served by many of these routines. You've got a wide grip row, which is not really any lat at all. And you've got a pullover, which is part of a complex, which is the only other thing that's really doing you a decent kind of back training apart from the deadlift variation. There's no kind of proper sagittal plane pull here apart from the pullover, and there's no frontal plane pull. I'd say the back training part of it is definitely weak.
And you
Pressing
know what?
looks
I think that's fairly normal for Hoffman. I need to go back and look at some of his other work now, but I don't think in any of the Hoffman plans we've looked at, there's been much back work.
on the pressing side, it's okay. We've got an overhead press, we've got a bench press. There's probably a little bit missing there, because you probably can't get full coverage with just those 2. But it's a really good start, especially if it's a basic program. We've got a deadlift variation, which I've been critical of. Again, not very much hamstrings work. Just having a stiff leg in there is fantastic to see that. So, pleased. I mean, really, if you've kind of got a stiff leg deadlift and a squat, you kind of well on your way to maximizing lower body muscle growth with only a barbell. I think, you've done a really good job there already with those 2. So, with those 2 in place, with his 2 presses, military and bench press, and then, if he'd thrown in a couple of decent back exercises, for me, that would be, starting to look like a pretty decent kind of basic hypertrophy program with limited equipment. Obviously, calf raise, standing, fine for gastroc, and there's not really much else in there to talk about. I don't see the point in having multiple deadlift variations. I don't think that really is going to do very much.
Yeah, I wonder if he just did that because of his sort of bias towards weightlifting and
Yeah,
conventional
probably.
deadlifting.
So, from a bodybuilding point of view, with limited equipment, maybe just a barbell, I would say this could be improved. Take the athletic exercise or the ballistic exercises out. It could still be improved, I think, from a hypertrophy point of view with a bit more back exercise focus or intelligent programming for the back exercises, and maybe dropping the conventional deadlift out.
So if one didn't have access to a pull-up bar and you just had a barbell, so you would just add in an additional bent over row just with a closer grip?
I think that would be a definite way to move forwards. But honestly, bars are probably easier to get hold of and install than barbells are.
Yeah, I wonder how, because back then, obviously, as you pointed out, there wasn't a lot of people programming pull-ups until you had these sort of full gym type programs where they might even include some machines as well. And I wonder, I mean, obviously it's not hard to, you can use a piece of wood outside that's affixed to something,
Exactly. You
but
use a
it
tree.
just
I mean,
wasn't
not
popular.
complicated. That's it's not a difficult thing to do. So I don't think it's really kind of fair to kind of go, "Oh, well, we haven't got a pull-up bar, mate." No, that's not an
Solve
acceptable
it.
not an acceptable, kind of complaint. So that would be, just treating it as a bodybuilding routine. Treating it as an athletic routine, it's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. I mean, this is gonna fit really, really well with the podcast that comes out on Wednesday in High Performance Physiology, where we actually start to explain why the proximal to distal sequence means that when you're picking exercises for the purposes of an athletic development program, especially hypertrophy exercises, you need to be very careful about which muscles you're training. So this is a myth that I think some fitness influencers who write programs for bodybuilding have been perpetuating. They've been saying that, if you're an athlete, just play your sport and, do my bodybuilding program and you'll be fine.
Mhm, mhm.
Absolutely not. That isn't going to work because as an athlete, you want almost to focus the maximum amount of your hypertrophy training on proximal segments because those are the segments that move more slowly in the context of athletic movements. If you're looking at the more distal segments, they're moving too fast to really contribute anything in terms of the overall athletic activity. Fast movements mean that you can't really exert force very effectively. So you want to be focusing on the proximal stuff. Explain this in a lot of more detail, physiologically in detail in the out and the podcast that will come out on Wednesday. I look at this and I'm like, no, yes, the stiff leg deadlift is fantastic because that's giving you a lot of hip extensor development, hamstrings and adductors. But I'm going to need a hip thrust in there really because I need the glute to really be, really maximally developed. I don't really want to focus much on the quads. So squat is okay, but I wouldn't want to go overboard. And I absolutely don't want calf raises in there.
Which is what
That's
you're
just not
explaining with the proximal distal anyway. So that's, I mean, calves are
exactly,
essentially
exactly.
the
That's
furthest
why I'm
away you could get and is going to slow you down
exactly,
sprinting, I
exactly,
imagine.
exactly it
Or
does. I mean,
kicking or
the quads
basically
do
any.
actually.
Yeah, okay.
So, and then there's no rotational stuff in here. I've got a side to side bend, but I need a rotational
Yeah.
movement in here of load to actually enable me to develop force producing capacity and rotation. That's again something that is often ignored.
Mm.
And when we talk about applications of various in the podcast that's coming out soon, we talk about, you know, when you're thinking about hip extension and proximal muscle mass exerting force on things, you've got to then think about, well, how am I transferring that? Now, the lower body does a pretty good job of that automatically, just the way it's set up, but the upper body is not so good. So if you've got a situation where you're trying to extend the hip, and okay, maybe you've just got your upper body that you're trying to move around, that's not too much mass in many situations. Okay, sure, there are some people who've got a heavy upper body in some sports because it requires that, but often the athlete is just flicking around the upper body. It's not such a big deal. But if you have a situation where the athlete is resisted at that top end of the torso, like for example in a grappling sport or in rugby and a scrum situation, in those kinds of situations, you're actually going to need to be able to keep the torso from, kind of bending in different directions. And that's when you start to need the ability to actually, have exercises that are going to stop that. Now, there's a little bit in here of that because deadlift variations aren't, horrible in that respect. But I would also want something like a good morning in there because I'd actually want that resistance specifically, to be trained, the ability to keep that torso in that position while using the hip extensors. Again, not just about um, it's not just about saying, "Oh, yeah, we need to get as much muscle mass on the athlete as possible." It's about saying, "Where do I want that?" And with an athlete, you want it mostly proximally. You don't really want it going too far away from your kind of core sort of torso and hip.
It's an interesting rhetoric. And again, I don't want to go down this path too much because you have a whole podcast on it. But it's the world I grew up in. That was the narrative. It was saying, hey, if you have an athlete, you don't need to know how to program for that athlete. You need to know how to program to get someone strong and build muscle, and all the athletic stuff they'll do with the athletic coach. And I think ultimately, I feel like it just came out of laziness, out of a, well, I don't want to have to learn about all these different sports and how to program effectively for them. So I'm just going to stick to this one thing that I know how to do, which is this program general hypertrophy.
Well, that's the same as hypertrophy researchers not wanting to learn about fatigue or psychomyogenesis or, any of the other things that they don't learn about because they're, lazy. Well, I don't know what they are, but they don't learn about those things. So, you know,
But it's convenient if you have a nice narrative that makes it
but it's
sound.
very convenient when you look at it and somebody goes, "Oh, those things aren't relevant." I'm like, "Oh, it's very convenient that you think they're not relevant because it means you don't have any work to do on those things." But yeah, I mean, the point I'm making is that, an athletic program is always going to focus the development of muscles more proximally. And so if you just have a typical bodybuilding program, it's not going to work for them because you're not going to have the same focus on hip thrusts and stiff legs and good mornings and, kind of maybe sort of back work as is a complete absence of back work in this program. But, you know, it's going to be exercise selection thing first and foremost, and your athletes can end up looking different. One thing I didn't say on the podcast that's going to come out on Wednesday that I kind of chatted about we joked about before we recorded when I was talking with Rob is that I think there's this tendency in the fitness industry to believe everything they see. Let me explain what I mean. So, one of the questions I get when I answer athletic questions on my Instagram, I get a bunch of people. Like, for example, I answered some questions on Instagram the other day and I said, sprinters don't actually have bigger quads than many other athletes. They actually have relatively small quads and huge hips and hip extensors and hip flexors. And I had a bunch of people message me saying, every time I see a sprinter on TV, they've got gigantic quads. I'm like, okay, so what you're telling me is that the cameraman who is filming that event is showing you pictures of people with big quads. And that makes you think that what you see is all there is, which is a famous kind of psychological bias, you know, sort of coined by Daniel Kahneman. What you see is all there is. So you think that because every time you see a sprinter on TV, they've got huge quads, you think that all sprinters have huge quads. Well, imagine that you're a cameraman at an event, and you've probably seen this on sporting events. Cameramen tend to point the camera at things that they think the audience is going to want to see. So they don't just point the camera at whatever there is. So they're not just kind of randomly scanning the crowd. If you've got a cameraman pointing the camera at the crowd, they'll pick out people who are photogenic, who are doing something interesting, who, kind of arouse emotion, who the crowd is interested in seeing. The same thing happens when you're at a sporting event. The cameraman will point the camera at things that he thinks are impressive, interesting, that the audience will resonate with. So when you're looking at like sporting events on TV and you go, every time I look at this athlete or these athletes on TV, they've got this characteristic. I'm like, maybe that's just what the cameraman is pointing his camera at. You're engaging in the psychological bias of what you see is all there is. In other words, you don't think about things that you're not seeing.
So you're
And that's just how
saying, you're
human beings are
telling me
operating.
if I Google runners' quads and look at the images, that's not representative of the average runner's quads. I don't believe that. That's
There
no
you go.
way.
Exactly. So what happens is you end up believing that the information you're being shown, because ultimately, if you think about it, if you go back, sort of thousands of years, what you saw then was pretty much all there is, or all there was, because that was your environment. You saw everything. Everything there was to see, you saw it more or less. Now you're getting like tailored kind of snippets of information being shown you on a screen, and it's highlights of what people think you're interested in. And as a result, you get this extremely skewed version of what you think reality is. And I think this is one of those wonderful examples of how that phenomenon is starting to shape people's expectations. And that's why I get these messages from people saying, oh, every time I see a runner or a sprinter, they've got huge quads. And I'm like, here is a study showing that sprinters don't have huge quads. Like, that's a cross-sectional study done, kind of literally measuring, you know, the sizes of muscles in sprinters and comparing them with, either other athletes or sedentary people or whatever, and the quads really don't pop out as being a muscle that's way bigger than any of the others. Hip extensors and hip flexors are absolutely off the charts in these sprinters compared with, sort of
Which
untrained
is
people.
interesting in and of itself. Is that due to what they're doing in the weight room, or is that actually due to other stuff they're doing?
Well, to a certain extent, a sprinter is going to increase muscle size in the hip extensors and flexors from sprinting because you get eccentric loading. People forget that, eccentric loading is going to create, muscle growth even when it's fast. Don't tend to get the same benefits from the concentric phases. But yeah, they're also doing a lot of weight room stuff. But remember, this is survivorship bias to a certain extent. The best sprinters are going to have big hip flexors and extensors, even if they were, I'm not going to say born like that, but like, kind of
I
genetically
suppose.
tending in that direction because that's what makes them faster. So you're going to observe them. Again, you have to, well, when you're making observations, it's really important to establish what you're observing and how it is possible for people who have ended up in that situation. If you have a competitive scenario, people are going to end up in that highly competitive scenario, not just because they've done stuff, but because they are just built like that. But either way, it's kind of fitting with what we already know about the biomechanics of sprinting, which I will obviously cover in the high performance physiology podcast at some point, which is that you kind of want proximal muscle mass and in the case of sprinting, it's hip flexor and hip extensor muscle size that does that job.
Plenty to get into. Looking forward to listening to the episode. So today, what are we talking about?
Something completely and utterly different. So, um, really, today, I'd like to, we're going to probably do this as a two-parter, I think we said.
This will be our first
Something else.
two-parter.
Is it?
I
Okay.
believe so. Yeah.
So we're going to talk about insufficient sleep today and again probably next time. And the interesting thing here is that, okay, so maybe start with a couple of quick definitions so that people listening can set this in context and understand how it relates to what they're going to find in the literature. So I'm using the term insufficient sleep, which is not used in the literature. And I'm doing that deliberately because I want to kind of just have a generic terminology that doesn't have a specific, kind of numerical meaning to it. In the literature, you'll find the terms sleep deprivation and separately sleep restriction. Now, there's a little bit of confusion over that, but I'll explain what it is. So normally in human studies, sleep deprivation refers to no sleep at all. So you're testing the effects of like a lack of sleep, insufficient sleep, and you just ask people not to sleep for the whole night, and then you do some tests the following day. Separately, you can have sleep restriction, which is where you kind of go in and wake them up after like maybe 4 hours. So usually it's around about half the night of sleep that you would normally get. So you can have sleep deprivation, you can have sleep restriction. I'm using the term insufficient sleep to capture all of that for reasons that I'll explain later on. Now, the complexity or the annoyance arises in two respects. Firstly, if you look at sleep deprivation models in animals, generally speaking, it's not always a complete lack of sleep of any kind. They'll still use the term sleep deprivation because what they're doing is they're stopping REM sleep from happening. Now, there's a couple of different ways of doing this. One of the most kind of elegant ways is that they have a sort of an environment, sort of a cage, if you like, if it's rats, and it'll have separate segments of the cage at different heights. So you've got like, say, maybe multiple platforms. They call it the multiple platform method. And essentially there's multiple kind of heights. And the heights of the platforms change over time. So some of them are slightly higher, some of them are slightly lower. And what they've got in the cage is a level of water which is above the level of the lowest segments and below the level of the highest segments. And so what happens is the rodent will be sitting on one of these platforms that's dry, but in time, the platform will drop below the level of the water and it wakes it up and it will wander over and sit on the other platform that's dry. So what it does is it stops the rat from getting more than about however many minutes of sleep at a time, and it stops it going into REM sleep. So it's actually really, really clever because it mimics what you might expect to find in a rodent environment where water could be coming around. It takes the stress element out, or the shock sort of element of stress out. So, you could do a sleep deprivation by picking the rat up every time it went to sleep, but that's very, very stressful. you know, I've talked before about, kind of stress studies and like people saying, oh, is this a stressor? Is exercise a stressor? And I'm like, and they've got, oh, these rodent studies show that exercise is a stressor. And I'm like, yeah, if you're a rat sitting in a cage and the hand of God comes down and pulls you out of the cage, sticks you on a treadmill and pokes you with a stick until you run, that's stressful. That would be stressful for me, right? So you've got to be really careful about these situations of dividing off what's stress and what's not stress. And what I like about the multiple platform model is it actually just uses a very tiny little amount of water, just enough to wake the rat up and cause it to move to a dry platform where it then goes back to sleep, but then wakes up again before it goes into REM sleep. So you have sleep deprivation in a way that's not actually the complete absence of sleep, it's the absence of REM sleep, which is very, very slightly different from what we're talking about in humans. But functionally, it kind of ends up in the same kind of place. And I'm not a sleep expert. Plenty of other people have talked about it. Go and, watch what they have to say. Hopefully it'll support what I'm saying. Similarly, just on a terminology point, you'll come across the fact that sleep restriction is sometimes called partial sleep deprivation, which is very frustrating. But again, that's just terminology. So if you see the term partial sleep deprivation, it means sleep restriction. Otherwise, we've kind of got these two separate terms, deprivation and restriction, one meaning no sleep or at least no REM sleep, and one meaning partial night of sleep, not a whole night of sleep. So that's the kind of basic terminology. You'll also find one other element of terminology which refers to whether or not it's a single night of no sleep or insufficient sleep or multiple nights of insufficient sleep. That is the term persistent. So if you come across the term persistent sleep deprivation, that means multiple nights of no sleep, or at least no REM sleep. If you come across the term persistent sleep restriction, that means multiple nights of half a night of sleep usually. So that's like the literature that you'll kind of find if you go digging through, especially in relation to exercise and recovery and that kind of thing. What I'd like to talk about today, though, and this is kind of not a huge topic really, but it's what is the impact of a night or multiple nights of insufficient sleep on the workouts that we're going to be doing. So I get this question a lot. People often write to me saying, if I have a bad night of sleep, what does that then mean for my workout that I'm going to do the following day?
Just before you go any further, I didn't
Yeah, go for
obviously
it.
the plan I discussed at the start of this episode had nothing to do with sleep, and it's not easy to find silver era plans that have to do with sleep. But that doesn't mean that sleep wasn't a focal point. And almost every single book I own on silver era lifting has a segment on sleep. And they all talk about how important sleep is. Like, it is never overlooked. Now, what I think is interesting, and I don't know if you'll touch on this in more detail or not, but I would say, like, in a traditional sense in the bodybuilding world, it was always highlighted, hey, sleep matters. Rest and recovery, obviously that was seen as being important, but part of that was sleep. And that meant that you needed to be, aiming to get 8, 9, sometimes people would say as many as 10 hours of sleep a night. And, obviously people would talk about kind of like nighttime habits, not eating too close to bed, all these things that would make one sleep in a better quality. And my perception, at least online, maybe a little bit more recently, is in the hypertrophy world, people seem to be kind of minimizing the impact of sleep and maybe saying, you know what, maybe it's not as important as we thought it was. Maybe you don't need to worry about it, blah, blah, blah. And it's interesting that, again, if we just look at, well, what did people think before any other influences? There was certainly a very high emphasis on the importance of sleep.
Yeah, and I think we can kind of track that over time and understand what the trajectory was of those ideas. Because if we start with the silver era, it's like, the programs that they were doing at the time were absolutely, recoverable in the large majority. It's like, most people are not doing more than 3 sets per muscle group per workout, and they're not training more than every, sort of 48 hours. Doing 3 times a week, and we're doing sensible volumes per muscle group. Recovery is not like a big deal. We're going to talk about recovery and sleep next time. But I'm just pointing out that in the context of the silver era, sleep being important is a obviously is on a recognizable feature, but nobody's claiming it does magical things. What I think happened as we entered into the post-steroid era is that people started saying things like, "There's no such thing as overtraining. There's only undersleeping and undereating." And that's magical thinking, because that's what I've been pushing back against. And people are saying, oh, well, you just have to sleep more. And I'm like, no, there's a point at which no amount of sleep is going to fix anything. But we'll explain all of that next time in the context of recovery. I think that's why what we've got now is a reaction against the kind of the 80s idea or 90s idea that you can sleep your way out of any kind of, amount of silly training. When they're doing, crazy amounts of sets. That's not true. You create a problem of that magnitude, you can't sleep your way out of it. That's not to say that sleep isn't doing good stuff. It's just there's a limit to what it can do for you. So I think that's kind of why it's historically gone the trajectory that it's gone. It's we're having a reaction against that silliness. But yeah, totally agree with you. It's like if we can get back to that idea of it being important, but not like some kind of panacea that fixes every single problem that might be possibly, occurring as a result of your silly training programs. Like, it's like it's not a get out of jail free card. It doesn't kind of fix everything. But anyway, yeah, that would be my perspective on that. So, but today, I just want to point out what is happening with, workout performance, not recovery from workouts, but actually, if I just like randomly have insufficient sleep for one night or a couple of nights, what's that then doing for a workout that I try and do afterwards? Well, before I get into the magnitude of the effect, let me just describe the basic physiological kind of scenario. Essentially, we've got two things that are happening that are problematic. Firstly, we start to lose the ability to concentrate on what we're doing, and that disrupts our coordination pattern. So straight away, from an athletic point of view, and this ties into obviously the athletic theme of this particular episode, but if we're thinking about it from an athletic point of view, we're not going to be able to improve the motor learning, the coordination of the athlete's skills if we are trying to train them in a state of insufficient sleep. It's going to be disrupted because you need a maximum level of coordination, if not a better level of coordination than the one you've already got stored in the brain, to change anything. The brain isn't going to change your existing motor programs if you don't show it something better than it's already got. So you have to be optimizing, kind of the movement pattern in order to make a change. So insufficient sleep is going to stop that happening. And so your skill session is basically worthless. So in the examples of where people write to me saying, should I go and train after I've been, sort of out all night? Or should I go and train if I've had a bad night's sleep? I'm like, well, what's the goal of the training session? If you're doing a skill training session as an athlete, you're trying to get better at, I don't know, free throws or something. Don't. There's no point. You're literally better off going back to bed. I'm not commenting on how sleep restrictions should be fixed. I'm commenting on, not training because it's not going to achieve anything. You're not going to be able to improve a coordination pattern if you are training in a sleep restricted or sleep deprived state. It's not going to happen. Now, from a hypertrophy point of view, not really that big a deal. It's not really going to be a problem. So it's really an athletic problem on the coordination side. It's not going to have a meaningful effect in terms of muscle growth. So I don't think that will be something that I'll be concerned about. The second thing that happens is that we experience disagreeable sensations, which are now obviously putting us squarely into the territory of supraspinal central nervous stability. So you're now going to experience a drop in motor unit recruitment. That's going to stop you from increasing motor unit recruitment as an adaptation. It's also going to have a small negative effect on hypertrophy. Do I think the effect on hypertrophy is really big? Not in the majority of cases, but it's there and it's, kind of physiologically, verified. We've got a situation where we're likely to experience a small reduction in the hypertrophy stimulus and a definitively large, if not complete, absence of adaptation regarding the large effect or the absence of effect on the motor unit recruitment adaptation. So again, it's hitting the athlete a lot harder than it's hitting, or strength athletes especially, than it's hitting the bodybuilder. So broadly speaking, physiologically, this is much more of an athletic problem than it is a bodybuilding problem. As regard to workout performance, we're going to talk about the kind of effects on recovery and adaptations, in terms of hypertrophy next time. But just in terms of workout performance, I think it's an athletic problem rather than the body. And then finally, really, the only thing I wanted to add is that, like with the pushback that you were mentioning earlier, where people are starting to say, sleep isn't really a big deal for bodybuilding. The issue is that a lot of people have gone to the literature and they've noticed that a single night of sleep restriction, because to be fair, most of the time when people are talking about this stuff, they're not talking about, working an all-nighter.
No,
They're
they're not.
talking
They're normally
about
talking about a poor night of sleep. Yeah.
exactly. They're just saying like, I was lying there for hours and I just couldn't get sleep, or I woke up a bunch of times and it's like I calculated I maybe had 3.5 hours of sleep in total and I feel, rough. So what people have noticed is that the effect of sleep deprivation tends to be pretty negative on workout performance the following day, whether it's aerobic or anaerobic or strength training. In contrast, the effect of a single night of sleep restriction isn't necessarily always a big deal. And so people have said, oh, well, sleep deprivation is the big thing to worry about. So as long as you're not pulling all-nighters, you can have bad nights of sleep and it doesn't matter. And that's where a large number of people are in terms of the influencer community, I think, at the moment. The issue is that if you actually go and look through all of the studies that exist on this topic, what you'll find is that it's about the amount of sleep that you haven't had recently that's the problem, not the single night that you've just had. So what you can see is that if you have persistent sleep restriction of, say, 2 nights in a row, and you've had only 4 hours per night, and you should be getting 8, if that's, your typical amount of sleep, then what you'll find is that is basically gonna create the same negative effect on the workout as a single night of no sleep of, like, of 8 hours, 'cause numerically, you've got to the same sleep debt. So what we can see is that, broadly speaking, loss of sleep, lack of sleep, insufficient sleep is a numerical problem. If you have, like, an entire week of poor sleep, you're gonna be basically in a sleep equivalent of a sleep-deprived state of maybe even 2 nights in a row, which is as we were chatting before, and I said I've done this once, absolutely horrific. It's like 1 night of sleep, you feel sorry, 1 night of total sleep deprivation, you feel rough. 2 nights of sleep deprivation is another world of pain. It's remarkable. But I would say that if you're not sleeping well for a whole week, you are gonna feel pretty horrible, even if it's only partial sleep deprivation or sleep restriction. It's gonna create supraspinal CST. It's gonna disrupt your coordination pattern. As an athlete, you're not gonna be improving motor skills. You're also not gonna be improving motor unit recruitment levels. And from a bodybuilding point of view, you're probably losing a small percentage of the motor units that you're able to access. You're losing some hypertrophy there. If you've previously produced hypertrophy in those muscle fibers, you're now going to be in an atrophy state. You're going to be, kind of losing muscle mass in those particular areas. So I think the reason for just kind of talking about this today is just to point out that sleeping forever or, kind of in silly quantities is not a get out of jail free card. It doesn't fix bad training programs and enable you to do whatever you want to do. But, losing sleep, whether it's a full night of sleep that you've lost or whether it's just a partial night of sleep that you've lost, is going to add up and is going to have negative effects, more on the athletic side, but definitely to a certain extent on the kind of the bodybuilding side, just much smaller in magnitude because you're only dealing with one adaptation you're worried about rather than three.
I think Poliquin used to talk, I'm sure other people did too, but I think Poliquin used to talk about kind of making up for that sleep debt on the weekend. So maybe, you have on weekdays, whatever, because of work or other commitments, you're only sleeping 6 hours. And then on a weekend, you might be sleeping 10 or 12 hours or whatever those nights. So is there potentially some validity to that? Not that that would be a intelligent sort of a strategy to try to implement like, consistently. But if there were days where one knew that they weren't able to get sleep, you're saying that actually having some days where you have maybe more sleep if you're able to, if you're not just waking up at the normal time, that could more quickly mitigate or reverse some of that reduction?
Yeah, so I think there's a little bit of data showing that, if you can grab naps here and there, that does help, and making up for sleep does help. I don't think it's a replacement for a proper sleep schedule. I think that's probably the ideal scenario. So yeah, that's one of those questions that's always an interesting one to try and answer. It's like, because the answer is, well, yes, it's going to help, but equally, I don't think it gets you back to sort of square one. I don't think it is literally exactly the same scenario as if you hadn't gone there in the first place. I think you're always going to be better off doing it properly. I don't think you can completely. Another kind of similar question would be, if I'm in a sleep restricted state, if I am suffering from supraspinal CNS, can I use a technique to increase motor unit recruitment in order to get me back to a higher level of recruitment? The answer is yes. So, if you're, suffering from a lack of sleep and you feel like your motor unit recruitment levels are going to be reduced as a result, can you use motivational techniques? Can you listen to exciting music? Can you train with a gym partner? Can you get psyched up? Yes, you can do all of those things. Does that get you back to the point where you would be if you'd done those things from a fresh state? Probably not, but it does absolutely move you in the right direction. So again, it's like, we're talking about ways to mitigate problems, but equally, you're not going back to the state that you would have been in if you hadn't have suffered the problem in the first place. And I think that's one of the most common misconceptions I see in the industry about any of these things is like, you know, can I kind of completely negate the effects by doing something else? I'm like, yes and no. You can move in the right direction. You can absolutely start to fix the problem, but I don't think you can ever, because physiology just doesn't allow you to have a free lunch. It doesn't work like that. It's like there has to be a cost of doing business somewhere.
So if one were like a lifelong insomniac and they were consistently in this state of insufficient sleep, then you made a comment before about if someone had been able to access higher threshold motor units and they'd grown muscle in those fibers and then they had this insufficient sleep, they
Yeah,
would actually be atrophying. But in that situation, that person may never have even got to that point because
correct. They
this is
might
a
just
chronic
have
state for them.
really big voluntary activation deficits. Yeah,
Mm.
so
So
it
they
may
may
just not.
not notice anything because that is essentially just their baseline.
Sure. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Like
So
if someone's
baseline,
listening to this and like,
that's
oh,
what
but
a
I function
baseline
just fine.
is. That's what a
Yeah.
baseline is,
Yeah.
you know.
So I want to touch on a couple of ways I program to mitigate this in clients. Obviously, my preference is always that they are prioritizing sleep, and that I have anecdotally seen big differences in clients, especially PTs. PTs are so bad at this because just the work schedule. Yeah, often people have early morning clients that might be there at 5 a.m. and then they've got, post after work clients and they're there till 7, 8 p.m. And I've worked with a lot of coaches where they're telling me, hey, I just can't get more than 6 hours. And they often think that they've got, other sort of health issues going on and, chronic fatigue or this, that, or the other deficiencies, whatever. And whenever I'm able to convince those coaches to maybe give up those morning sessions or an evening session or whatever it is to get more sleep, the feedback I consistently get, and often people fight me on this for like 6 months. I'm like, no, 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 it's not that, it's not that, it's something else. And then they finally do it and like, oh my God, I've come alive. Like I have so much more energy. I feel normal. I didn't realize it was that. So obviously, I think that should be the goal is how can we actually achieve consistently good sleep? But if I did have a client who, an event came up or they just had a poor night's sleep or whatever it was, some of the suggestions I give to them, one would be, and this ties into what you said about motivation, is I normally get them just to drop back to a single set. And that single set, and assuming we're doing a multi-set program, that single set, obviously that's going to get the work done that we needed to get done in terms of at the very least, preventing atrophy in those fibers, but hopefully we might even, grow some new muscle growth in that session and in those single sets. But it has an extra motivation effect there. And I think you talked about this maybe last podcast or in some recent podcast where you talked about doing that single set. Obviously, people see this performance boost that they don't see with multi sets. So that's something I'm sort of using as a hack, not to be like, oh, you don't have energy to do multi sets, more as a, hey, I'm going to give you this as a motivational tool. You don't know why we're doing it per se, but I bet that single set is going to perform just as well as what your normal sets would be in a normal, state of sleep. Do you have any comment on that?
I was just thinking while you were talking through that, that if you imagine that you've got this effect, I mean, if somebody, I mean, back up a little bit. One of the questions I get that I don't always share is people will write to me asking what they should do for their master's thesis or their kind of project that they're working on. Right the way up into kind of PhD territories, people will say, how do I set up an experiment to address this question or in this field? If somebody's listening to this and they've got the opportunity to do a project, I would be really fascinated to just see it documented that if you're doing 3 sets to failure, you are gonna get fewer reps on your first set than if you do a single set on its own.
Mm,
Because I've seen this so many
yeah.
times where you go into the gym and you know you've got 3 sets to do. You back off your effort levels on your first set. So you're getting more volume in terms of your 3 total sets, but your first set is definitively further away from failure than you're capable of actually doing. And so I just wonder, what physiologically we're seeing differ between those scenarios. I mean, in the model that I'm working on, you should just see that you've got fewer stimulating reps on those first sets than you would have been otherwise. But the issue is that fatigue mechanisms are building up over the course of those, sets as you go into the workouts. Are we losing something by doing multiple sets that we're getting by doing single sets? I think that thought exercise is something that I'm going to spend some time just trying to understand. I think the effect is probably very tiny, but nevertheless, there is something there that I think is, and certainly on the multi-unit recruitment side, we're obviously going to be able to increase recruitment to a better extent by doing single sets than doing by doing multiple sets because you're obviously a higher level of central motor command than you would be doing otherwise. So there's something there in terms of recruitment. Whether it translates through to hypertrophy, I don't know.
Well, but presumably though, if it was allowing for more recruitment, then that's going to directly affect.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I'm not convinced it does allow for more recruitment. It might just allow for more central motor command, and it might just be a little bit more firing rates, which might not really translate to anything
Okay, so
particularly
it could
interesting.
just be performance then in that case.
Yeah, it might not really, because ultimately, we're hitting pretty much maximal recruitment on sort of the fifth rep before failure. So I'm not sure
But if
we're
you were
really
increasing motivation and then that was
sure.
increasing.
So your entire level of recruitment might jump up. That's what I'm saying. There might be a small effect, and it might actually be that you're hitting different motor units by doing that.
Mm,
Because we do think that if you sufficiently increase motivation, it will actually access more motor units, and you are going to get definitively different muscle fibers being trained. So to the extent that that actually does happen, I'm saying, is the effect big enough to trigger that?
mm,
I don't know.
mm. Yeah, interesting. So, and another strategy I use with clients who, maybe have had a bad night or they're just not feeling it that day or whatever is, and it's, for me, as I explain this, it's interesting looking back or looking over it and thinking, oh, these are all motivational techniques. Even this single set is a motivational technique. And I don't necessarily put it in that category or identify it as such, but that's what these are, is I get clients to identify, okay, if this is you're feeling tired, you're not feeling motivated, we're going to go get the work done. What I want you to do is identify, like look at your program and look at what is the lift that you think you actually have the best chance of progressively overloading that day. Maybe last session it just felt a little bit easy, like it felt good. And so that is your goal this session. And so I'm setting them an external goal. And that's just acting essentially as a motivator.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think, there's lots of ways to motivate people. I was just laughing at myself, actually. I wasn't laughing at anything you were saying. I was laughing at myself because, um, I mean, most people who listen to this podcast know that for a number of years I had a pretty unhealthy relationship with pull-ups. So my kind of my pulling strength, vertical pulling strength is pretty silly, and for an old man who doesn't look that big, I can move some pretty horrible weight on a lat pull down. And so, you're in a commercial gym and there's some big guys monopolizing the lat pull down. It is very motivating for me to follow them and go on when they finish the machine and, put the weight up a few more, kind of a few more selectors and pull something that they were probably fighting with. There's a number of things that you can do. I was laughing at myself because I have that horrible habit of doing that. But it's like, it's not like I can do it on any other exercise. It's just, I think your history kind of stays with you in strength training for a number of reasons. Yeah. So anything that's motivational, however your personality is constructed, I think, however, you need to do those things, is valuable to consider that in situations where sleep is a kind of a problem. Um, and everybody's got their own palette of things that work for them. Few kind of summary posts of various things, and I'll probably do more in the future. But there's a lot of ways that we could increase recruitment. I mean, we talked about one recently in the carbohydrate mouth rinsing thing. So anything that reduces discomforting sensations around the inflammation or so exercise order, like you were mentioning, exercise selection, the total magnitude of volume that you're doing, the sensations of low muscle glycogen or low blood glucose. You can address all of those things. I mean, you can, as I say, I'll do a cheat sheet at some point. But I think really when people are in situations that they've, like say for example, you've got a bodybuilder who's preparing for a competition, maybe they've got a really high kind of impact competition that's really important to them coming up. They want to make sure they do not make any mistakes and maybe they're worried and so they get a poor night of sleep, and like, okay, well, what can I do right now after I've woken up in the morning after a poor night of sleep? I've got a workout I've got to do today. What can I do in order to make sure that I lose the least possible, stimulus from this workout that I'm going into? Well, that's when you want your cheat sheet of things that is going to maximize, motor unit recruitment. So again, actually, this is something that we will do in the webinar coming up next Saturday. We'll say, look, that's a scenario that absolutely happened to you in the period of dieting that you're engaging in to, sort of get to this competition. You are going to lose muscle mass if you don't make sure that you've got, well, you are going to lose muscle mass, really, almost certainly. But, how can we mitigate that and make sure it's as little as possible? Well, okay, here's a cheat sheet of things that can maximize motivation or increase recruitment in other ways. You don't just have to chase the motivation stuff. You can, as I say, chase the reduce the sensations ideas like, you were describing with kind of um, mitigating producing the volume in the workout, and I was describing with the carbohydrate mouth rinsing. So,
Mm.
I think there's things that we can do, but at the end of the day, insufficient sleep is always going to be a problem. It's just how can we make it the smallest problem possible?
You mentioned napping before. Have you seen the data on, I don't know what they call it, caffeine naps, where you have coffee before a nap? Have you seen any of that research? Normally it'll be
I,
like cognitive ability and cognitive function.
I've seen titles of studies. I've never actually gone and read them. I don't want to know. Caffeine doesn't do anything for me. I'm one of those non-responders, so I've never been hugely interested in it. I mean, I've looked at studies showing that it does increase motor unit recruitment, and I think probably by increasing motivation, probably. But again, it's not been something that I've been hugely interested in jumping into reading about. But yeah, because I'm a non-responder, I can kind of either take it or leave it.
Yeah, okay.
It doesn't really excite me
Well, there
particularly.
seems to be a synergistic effect if one would have caffeine immediately before a nap, and it has to be a short nap. So, obviously you feel groggy if you sleep for too long. But, potentially if I'm not someone who can nap, but if you're someone who can nap, that might be another strategy you could employ if you've had an all-nighter or something before you get to the gym.
I'm not sure whether I can or not. I think the only times when I've experienced short periods of sleep that you might describe as napping has been when I've been traveling and I'm bouncing through time zones. And I'm not sure that's really applicable,
Not
kind of to
exactly the
the
same.
not exactly the same thing. It's like just sleeping because I haven't had enough sleep. But yeah, no, I'm not a siesta person particularly.
Now, a final point I want to make or ask you about is sometimes there's a narrative, and you touched on it with athletes to an extent where you said, hey, if you're seeking athletic development, go back to bed in this sleep deprived
Yeah.
state. Now, you often hear people talk about that from a bodybuilding perspective as well, where it's like, hey, and coaches say this kind of stuff, where it's like, if you've got, you've had a bad night's sleep, you're not feeling good that day, you're just not in the mood, like, it's going to be a poor session, don't do it. And in fact, that's not
So
necessarily good advice, is
no,
it?
I don't think that's right because you're gonna we'll go into detail on this next time, but I think you're gonna be in territory where you're reducing your workout frequency by doing that, and
Yeah.
that's gonna create an atrophy problem, and that will be exacerbated by the sleep loss, which we'll talk about next time. The point here is that we can mitigate a lot of the problems that relate to bodybuilding with strategies that increase motor unit recruitment, including the motivational stuff. So we don't need to go down the route of saying it's going back to bed territory.
Well, I
The
wonder if
the
this
only thing I
is.
wouldn't mention though is if somebody is building their bodybuilding workout around free weight exercises, especially ones with barbells that are requiring more coordination, I would be much more nervous about just saying, go ahead, go for it, do the best you can. Because I think that territory is in a scenario where your coordination is going to cause problems for you.
Sure, and that'll especially be, if someone's front squatting or doing some of these more complex lifts. If someone's doing a bench, it's probably not going to be a concern.
I always found bench quite technical, but okay.
Yeah, I know. We've had this conversation. I shouldn't use that as an example. I was going to say, I do wonder if some of this sort of overemphasis on that idea of go back to bed is rooted in progressive overload and sort of this idea that if you don't progressively overload a session, you go backwards in a session, then that session was a waste. That mentality, from my perspective, it's like saying, well, we know that being active during the day is going to cause less atrophy than bed rest. And it would be like saying, well, you should just go lay in bed instead of being active. Well, no, obviously, because higher levels of activity is going to maintain some muscle. So even if there were some detriment in performance in that session, well, you're still maintaining all the muscle that you were actually able to activate and use in that session, even if it was slightly less than normal.
And I think your previous solution is probably the best one in that scenario is go to the gym and if you're normally a multiple sets person, do single sets. Now, I think that would be the example of, you know, so if you're normally doing 2 or 3 sets, just go to the gym, do a single set of everything that you would normally do and do the best you can and come home. And it's like, no, you haven't made progressive overload. You can't possibly make progressive overload because you weren't doing the same thing as you were doing previously. So you've got no benchmark to kind of assess it against. But at least you've kind of prevented atrophy from happening. You can just now drop back into your normal schedule. And it's just like you've neither moved forward nor
Yeah.
backwards.
Yeah.
But actually, you might have moved a little way forwards, but not necessarily very much.
Insignificant. Yeah. The only time in my mind that I would think, oh, maybe there's some merit to not doing that would be if my schedule allowed me to train the following day. And I know, okay, I'm not, waiting two
Even
days or
then,
3 days or
even
whatever.
then, you're still doing a 24-hour atrophy issue, aren't you? Because
Yeah.
If you were previously training every other day or 3 times a week, you would have been literally showing up
Right on the edge
just
of that.
after the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
stimulus period ends. You're now inserting 24 hours of atrophy, which you
Yeah.
didn't need to do.
Yeah, I guess I'll be thinking about it if this is happening once in a blue moon. It's like, well, if there were some fatigue present, then, one extra rest day here and there is not going to be detrimental. But, if this is something that's happening once a week, that every Saturday night you're going out dancing and you're not getting back till, I don't know what time you get back. But yeah, I guess that's a situation where you say, well, no, we're going to stick to this normal frequency.
Yeah, I mean, again, we're describing scenarios in which, it's a small negative effect unless it's like as you say, happening every week. There's a small negative effect. But I do still think that your original solution was better.
Single set.
Yeah.
I think that's probably it from a performance side for sleep. So we are going to be covering part two, atrophy, recovery, hypertrophy, all of that side of
Next
things.
week is going to break some paradigms for people, I think.
Yeah,
We are going to, and this is not small amount of physiology. There is a large chunk of physiology relating to the negative effects of sleep on muscle mass um, directly, and there's quite a bit less, but still meaningful amounts on the negative effects of sleep on recovery post workout. I think most people instinctively kind of grasp the idea that poor sleep is going to slow down their recovery post workout. But I don't think many people know that if they go without sleep or they have restricted sleep for a meaningful period of time, they're actually going to start to see atrophy happening directly as a result of that sleep loss. And I think that is absolutely going to cause some people to flip out. So it'd be fun to do that episode. Look, looking forward to it.
yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting one. I think it was good that we ease people in today, but yeah, come back next week because it is.
Going to
I
break the
think it's going to
internet.
ruffle some feathers. Yeah. Anyway, we'll see all of you, or not see you. We'll hope that you hear us all next week. Thanks for joining us.